Hello and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. We are just 1 or at most 2 weeks away from the end of the state legislative session, sine die, as we like to say in terrible, probably mispronounced Latin. But we're that close to the end, and we are yet to see a budget proposal at all. We haven't seen one from anybody, not either party, not any office holder, not the governor, not the Democrats, not the Republicans, not even any private groups. Sometimes we're involved in submitting budgets for consideration as well, and we've not seen a cohesive budget proposed yet. Word on the street is that they are nearing a deal, and that we will likely see one next week. That is the week of the 16th through 20th. And when you think about timeline, I think that makes sense because often the legislature wants to leave a little bit of cushion so they can come back and override gubernatorial vetoes.
Special line item vetoes.
Especially line item budget vetoes. And so we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Joining me today, as always, are my co-hosts, Bailey Perkins-Wright. Hello.
Hello, Andy.
And Scott Melson. Hello.
Hello.
And listeners, hello to you as well. Guys, let's maybe start there with the budget for just a moment, since we're already talking about it. Bailey, anything that you expect to see in the next week? Is my take on this sound accurate to you? We expect to see it in the next few days?
Yes, and especially this is something that's common from year to year. This isn't an anomaly, right? The legislature takes up all kinds of bills throughout the year and devotes mainly the end of April and the month of May to the budget. And of course, there's budgetary conversations throughout the year, especially hearing what things lawmakers, want to move in advance, but also as, the dramas brew of, this person's bill didn't go through and that didn't get voted upon. Therefore, we're not going to go with this person's budget interest, right? So all of those, type of, politics happen. But there's always key members, which typically is the appropriations chair of the House, the appropriations chair of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, the President pro tem, the governor, and also probably, if not the Secretary of State, then the governor's budget person, at least those 5 people, maybe one other, key person in the process sits together, for hours, for those couple of weeks to pull together and negotiate what's going to be the final version of the budget. Then one day it appears and it moves through the process. Those 5 people take time to deliberately think about it because it has to pass both chambers and be signed by the governor. So it's in the best interest of the people who are coming together in the back room to be able to be on one accord on what the plan is. And to Andy's point, that doesn't always happen because sometimes there are vetoes that come from the governor, but sometimes the House and Senate are prepared for that, right? But the downside to that is that it doesn't leave room for perspective from all the other members, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
It's I don't know. It's 5 people in a room crafting $1 billion budget that is introduced 30 minutes before the committee meeting, passed on party lines, and then signed into law with minimal to no review, which is, I think, just what the founders intended. Right? That's democracy at work, right? So I think.
But even beyond the people, like as far as like the House and Senate members, Oklahomans don't get the opportunity to have a say about whether or not they like this budget or they don't like it. So I think that's definitely one of the flaws in the process. Like one of the things that constantly is lifted during legislative sessions was it the constitutional measure about like when education had to be funded.
Yeah, April 1st.
April 1st, and that deadline is never met. It's always surpassed, and it waits until this time in February. I mean, I'm February and May, where this omnibus budget is pulled together, right? And they do that on purpose because it leaves little room for anybody to piece it apart. They tried to make it to where everybody at least has their little part that they wanted to see. So everybody, at least to Scott's point, in the majority, you know, they get enough support to be able to move it through the process. Now, what I expect to see, I expect to see some temporary tax cuts, right? We're in a time where it seems like we're rolling in the dough. If you look at, you know, how much money has flown in the state through federal pandemic relief funding and other measures, like the transportation funding, right? That's coming down to the states. So this is a time where Oklahoma is far from a budget crisis in the way we were 5-6 years ago, right? So there probably will be some forms of tax cuts, but not permanent tax cuts, just while we got the money, right?
It's tax relief, Bailey. It's tax
Excuse
relief.
me, tax relief.
No relief, like tax relief, right?
And then what else would I expect to see? I definitely expect to see at a minimum flat budgets to modest increases for certain agencies, which everyone will be at the minimum happy that like they're not going to have to worry about losing what they had in previous years. But as we always say in the tax policy world, a flat budget is technically a budget cut because costs increase over time. And so I would expect to see maybe modest increases to many programs like in education, right? This is another year where they're probably going to say, we funded education more than any other time in Oklahoma history, right? When you look at just face value on the dollar and not.
But they'll give that money to like a specific pet project within education. And then they'll just say, we funded education. It's like, well, you gave it to, you know, wealthy private school or charter or something things in one small district or something.
Right.
I do think.
Go ahead, Andy.
I was saying, like, I think with some of the big shifts that are happening between state agencies, like the shift from the tax commission, moving motor vehicles from the tax commission over to OMES, then we'll see, you know, a big reallocation of money, which is appropriate. But I expect when that budget drops and the news writes about it, people will be like, holy crap, OMES got, you know, $300 million more. And it's like, well, there may be.
Well, they're taking on a whole new service.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But
well,
that does have like carryover effects, because that means the tax commission loses some economies of scale and that they have to make up. And so it is a bumpy transition.
Well, so this is the thing, right? Like, and this is part of the issue going back to just like, you know, the timing and, you know, yes, from a practical standpoint, you know, they do the budget at the end because it's the most contentious. They wait until 30 minutes before the meeting or 5 minutes before the meeting to give people the bill text because they don't want to fight over it. They want to push the deadline and say, you don't have time to read it. You got to trust us. We have to pass it right now. So either pass it or don't pass it. And then it gets passed. And they don't want to try and haggle with, you know, all, you know, 140 something members of the legislature over what's in the budget. But the problem, I mean, there's a lot of problems with that as we've already noticed, but the budget is super complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Bailey, this is what you do for your like living, right? Like government relations. Like, Andy, you and I like have watched this as carefully as I think anybody who's not in professional politics for the last several years. The budget process is complicated. The budget itself is complicated. The funding mechanisms are complicated. Reallocating funds, like, it's very, very complicated. There are literal PhDs who, like, working in and around and on the Oklahoma budget is their entire job.
And so many funding sources going into it too.
Yeah. And the other thing that happens is when it gets done kind of in a back room like this, and then you only have 10 minutes to read it, there's no time for explanation. right? Like you spend the next year explaining what the budget did and living with the ramifications of that, good or bad. And so, I really, it's not that it would matter because, as you guys already noted, right, they're constitutionally supposed to fund education by like April something every year, and it never happens.
I thought they repealed that.
Maybe they did. I don't remember. But I mean, I wish there was like a law that said the budget has to be the first thing that they do, but also that it has to be done like within the first 4 weeks of session. You can't do anything else to be done the budget, right? Like that's, we always hear politicians like talk about, we should run our budget the way that the families do around their kitchen table. Well, I don't like wait until the very last thing every month to decide how I'm going to spend my money for that month, right? Like it's,
Scott, you raise a great point because different states do their legislative sessions in different ways. Texas is a great example, right? Because we're always talking about competing with Texas. They have sessions every other year.
Right.
And in those off years, it's a budget session, right? So all they're talking about is their state's budget. I mean, yes, Texas is way bigger than us and has like, a way bigger budget than we do to tackle, but it's still, a great model, to have time where you're focused solely on the budget, and then in other times focus on those other things that need to be addressed. I mean, we already have, the setup in our process to where if there is an issue that comes up that needs to be tackled immediately, governor can call a special session, right? But I also love the idea of having dedicated time to focus on the budget, because that also keeps us from focusing on tedious things that are not relevant to anything but someone's reelection talking points, right? Every single year.
Right. Like, yeah. And so, it's neither here nor there. It's what it is this year. I agree, Bailey. I think we're going to see some temporary tax relief. They're not going to do things that are permanent, because then they would be faced with the uncomfortable prospect of potentially having to raise taxes, which is a very, very difficult task in the Oklahoma State Legislature. I'm very interested to see, personally and professionally, how managed care shakes out. That's one of the big issues. It's in conference right now. Hearing a lot of rumors. I don't know anything for sure, so I'm not going to say a whole lot more than that, other than there could be some pretty major changes coming to the state's Medicaid program. And it's not really clear yet exactly what that's going to look like. So that's a big source of intrigue right now. I agree, Bailey. I think the budget's going to be mostly flat, maybe a few areas that are increased a little bit, with some tax cuts that are due to expire in 2 to 3 years or something like that, so that they can renew them in the future if they need to, but they don't have to take any action for the taxes to go back up.
Yeah, I do think we should be on the lookout for the potential that the governor vetoes the budget this year, right? There, as session is winding down, the governor, in fact, just this week, right, vetoed a bill that would, on its face, make cross-jurisdictional enforcement of the law easier between the state and tribal jurisdictions, right? It was dealing with automobile tickets and driver's licenses and all of that, and he vetoed that. That bill passed the Senate unanimously, and I think there were 4 dissenters in the House. Just so, I mean, essentially,
but that's absolute spillover from the McGirt conflict that's happening between
the governor and
the governor and the tribal nations, right?
He doesn't want to appear soft on that, but I've heard that they may come back and override his veto on that, which I think would fuel his fire to veto the budget. And, as we'll get into in just a moment, all of this swaddlies and school shenanigans is not helping the executive branch build any goodwill with the legislature. And I think they might want to send a message to him saying, hey, we're not going to, yes, we gave you more power and authority to do things, but we're going to rein it in with the purse strings. And so he might say, well, this isn't the budget I want. This doesn't fund the things I want. This doesn't give credits to the things that I want. And he could veto it, in which case the legislature could come back and override it.
And they have the numbers to do that.
They have the numbers, and it would allow, perhaps, and this is like, the dark side of politics we don't like to acknowledge, but it would allow both the governor and the legislature to portray themselves as the good guy, right? The governor could campaign and say, like, I stood up to the legislature and I vetoed this, and I said no, I put my foot down, and his supporters would say, good on you, Kev, right? And then the legislature could say, we funded what we needed to, we took a measured approach, blah, 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 and their supporters would support them in doing that as well, right? So sometimes political theater plays out, with actual like dollars and cents.
Yeah, well, and I think you're right on that in terms of the budget. It is interesting to me. The governor has vetoed a number of bills this year, many of them that passed unanimously. Right? He vetoed this bill about cross enforcement between law enforcement agencies, between tribes and the state. He vetoed a financial transparency bill. He vetoed a bill that passed unanimously that required gubernatorial appointees to be subject to financial disclosure requirements. He vetoed that. The governor doesn't any shyness that he has had about what he thinks his power is or should be, or what kind of scrutiny or oversight the executive branch should or shouldn't be subject to. He's lost it. It seems pretty open that he thinks he should be able to do what he wants with little to no interference from the legislature.
Is there a time frame on how soon after a veto the legislature has to act to override it? Like, do they have 5 days?
I don't think there's a 5 days, but it definitely has to happen before sine die.
Right. So my question really was about that financial disclosures bill, right, that he vetoed, because I know a number of the legislative members are unhappy about that. And I wonder if that might be the thing, right? They come back and override his veto on that, and then he gets mad and vetoes the budget, and they come back and override that or something, right? Like something is always at work in the background. All right, well, let's move on from the budget. We'll talk about that a lot more in weeks to come once we actually see it. And let's move on to the latest updates on Barbecue Gate or Swadley's Gate, Foggy Gate. I don't know. Do we have an official scandal hashtag for this?
Regardless, we call it Soggy Bottom Gate.
Soggy Bottom Gate. That's good. Yeah. Regardless of, I guess, what we call it, I think there were two important developments this week that came to light. The first one is probably just worth a mention. The second one we'll talk a bit more about. The first one was another excellent report from the Frontier. And the headline says, quote, months before seeking bids, a state tourism official spoke of a deal for Swadley's Foggy Bottom Kitchen to, quote, make money from day one. And indeed, that they got receipts, right? Like the conversation, the emails are basically like, we got you. We won't even charge you, and it's exactly what we've all thought was the case. And so
that's a government one-on-one, right? You don't put things in writing in that way, especially in a text message or an email or however that was done, like, because those things in moments like this can come back against you.
Right. What you're saying is, if you're going to break the law, at least don't email about it, right? Like, don't.
Not encouraging anybody to break the law,
right.
But it is a lesson that, when things can be used against you.
When you do your crimes, it is best not to leave evidence.
This reminds me, when I was in high school, one day I had someone break into my car and steal my Sony Discman, my CD player that I had one of those tape adapters, right? And little tape deck adapters, cassette tapes. Anyway, I left early that day, going to my great grandmother's funeral, and I got to my car, and I immediately noticed that the cords were there, but the CD player was gone. I was like, what in the world? And so in the back seat, some stuff was like messed up, and there was a hall pass in my car with someone's name on it. And I drove home because I thought we had to go. And my mom was like, oh, we got time, go back up to the school. So I went up there and I went to our assistant principal and, told him what happened. And he was like, I said, I don't know if anyone would be dumb enough, but I found this. And he looked at it and said, he is. I said, he is what? And he said, he's dumb enough. I was like, okay, if the assistant principal knows you by name because he saw your name on a hall pass and all he says about you is that you're dumb enough, you do not have a good relationship with that AP. And indeed, he had just got off the phone with him or with the police because that student had left school and was walking down the street, and a police officer saw him and picked him up for truancy and was bringing it back to the school. And
was he carrying a Discman?
He wasn't. He had sold it to somebody else, which he confessed to. So I got it back and was able to go home. When I got it, it had somebody else's CD in it, and I tried to give the CD to the cop, and the cop was like, "I don't want that." I was like, "I don't want it either. It's not my CD."
What was it?
I don't know. Not my kind of music. And so anyway, so sometimes people they do leave a trail. Now, let's say the state tourism official who spoke of that deal was Gino DeMarco, whose name comes up now weekly, I think, with this deal.
I mean, at least it's every time Gino DeMarco is in the news now, it's for doing something shady, right? Whether it's PPE or whether it's tourism, or he's on the board of the healthcare authority now, right? Or is he on the board of the state department of health? He's on board of the healthcare authority. Good God, what's gonna happen there?
Yeah, I have not seen his name, for winning 40 under 40 or one of those kinds of things. The other development this week that I think is really just the tip of the iceberg on this deal is that the House Special Investigative Committee that is formed to look into this scandal held their first hearing this week. They had sent out subpoenas to a number of people, some of whom did not come anyway. And they heard testimony from, I know, the director of LOFT, right, the Legislative Office of Fiscal Transparency, Mike Jackson. He was there, and I think he was most of the time. There's a few other officials that are like lower level deputy directors who also spoke, but it was a really interesting. And to me, the top line takeaway is that Director Jackson said that 12.4 million of the 16.7 million that were given to Swadley's was essentially misspent. That is 74% of the money that Swadley's received. Loft is saying that shouldn't have gone to him.
And they bought smokers for a menu that didn't require smoked meat, right?
Yes,
so that's the other piece too, that if you are going to use government money to purchase things, you shouldn't buy things that don't align with the thing you said that you're going to use it for, right?
They also, and this has been glanced over, I think, in some of the media reports, but when they talked about it before, when this all first came out, they bought smokers. And then in the emails, like Swadley basically said, or one of his people said, we're going to move the smokers from a couple of our restaurants to these state parks because we don't like the ones we have. And they were buying new ones for their restaurants. I want to go back and do some research because I'm like 98% sure that's how it was phrased. And I was like, well, did we then buy equipment not for the parks, but for their restaurants, and we got hand-me-downs and they still charged us more than double?
That's what happened.
In this report yesterday, on Thursday, is when Director Jackson was speaking to the committee. He said this happened because the State Department of Tourism lacked the proper checks and balances to audit this. 3 examples that he gave of how this money was misspent. One was that Swadley's travel was reimbursed multiple times, like 3 times. And although there was 1 month in 2020 where the amount of mileage that they were reimbursed, the amount of money, if you if you took the total amount of money and divided it by the federal reimbursement rate for mileage, which is 56 cents per mile, the Swadley's was paid enough for someone to have drive around the globe 4 times, right? Like there was no way they actually drove that many miles. Also, they, related to barbecue equipment, they apparently expensed a cheese melter, which I didn't know was a standalone device. I thought it was an oven. Or
yeah, I was gonna say I have a cheese melter at my house. We call it the oven.
Right. Yeah. Microwave. Or maybe even like a little torch, like a little.
So I'm actually, as we were sitting here, because I thought we were going here, I just did it. I did a quick some Googling. So you can go to Kitchen Monkey. You can go to kitchen-monkey.com. And you can get you a commercial cheese melter. Apparently, it's a device. Commercial cheese melter that's 24 inches for the making of delicious treats like nachos or sandwiches or what have you. So I can see that it's essentially a standalone broiler is what it looks like. I want to say, what's the one that they didn't they build a state like $10,000 for this thing?
Yeah, they expensed it for $11,600.
Okay, well, the commercial cheese melter that I just found on kitchenmonkey.com, restaurant equipment and supplies, this is listed here to retail for $341 American dollars and 4 cents.
Wow. The one that Jackson said that they could, well, he said the only one they could find, the most expensive one they could find was like $5,500, which is half of what they charged us.
I mean, I'm looking here and I'm seeing all of these are restaurant supply stores, and I'm seeing hell, the Williams and Sonoma one's only $165. So I mean, come on. Like, does anybody charge more? There's like $1,000 one that's 26 inches. But I mean, all of these are commercial. The most expensive, largest commercial cheese melter that I'm finding here on my my quick search is a 35-inch countertop cheese melter for $1,400. So
I mentioned this last week, right? Like, people complain about bureaucracy and regulation and things like that. But when you have protocols in place and you have, the objective selection processes for things, and you have the checks and balances in place, I won't say it completely eliminates, but it makes it a lot harder for these things to happen, right? When we just up and do whatever, and we let our friends and do contracts with them, and it leads to situations like this where we're buying $10,000 cheese melters that don't cost $10,000, right? And so, like, those safeguards are so essential, and it's also like imperative that we're holding our elected leaders and those who are appointed leaders in agency positions accountable to following those protocols, because while it seems tedious, not following the process led to these moments.
There's so many layers to this that rub, I think, voters the wrong way, right? And this, I will say, to your point,
as it should.
Right. I mean, but most directly to your point, there is no way that someone who is running a successful business would tolerate this kind of fiscal mismanagement, right? Like, you don't run a mortgage company and let people triple charge you for things, right? Like, this is not how it's supposed to happen. One of the other findings that Director Jackson reported during the meeting yesterday, or the hearing, was that there were 59 subcontractors that Swadley's hired to do repairs or upgrades to these parks. Now, I mean, it's not unusual to have a number of subcontractors, but 60 subcontractors for 6 parks, like, they missed out on economies of scale somehow, right? Like, why wouldn't you have the same few people do the work if it was going to be similar? And just as crazy, one of those subcontractors charged a $20,000 fee on top of the charge for their work, but their work was only $53,000. and then they added a $20,000 fee, and so that's $73,000. But then when Swadley's billed the state, they added their own fees on top of that, right? So we end up paying way more fees than the actual work cost, and like that's stealing.
I mean, this sounds like the defense industry, right? Like these guys think they're building the F-35 over here. I mean, it's a restaurant for a state park, you know,
right.
like.
And on top of that, a limited menu. It's not even the full Swadley's traditional menu. This is a separate thing.
And
so here's
I got one more thing, and I'm hot to say it. The other thing that stood out to me when I was listening to this is that they expected there to be some loss when they were starting out, right? Like they have to cover operational expenses until revenue is coming in. But as revenue grew, as customers came and they made more money, they actually reported higher losses to the state, which is not how that works, right? And they did this, it's pretty clear, because the state said, we will cover you. You won't have any losses for the first like $1 million of revenue or something. And so they just started like writing off and basically saying that they were not making money so that they could like keep their sweetheart deal even longer. And I was just like, wait, they sold more food and they lost more money? That's not how that works.
So here's a real question, guys, and I have no idea what the answer is. Where do we set the over-under that somebody goes to prison for this? Like, is somebody going to go to jail?
People who have money don't go to jail.
Yeah.
I do think there will be some financial fines. I could see that. You know what I'm saying? But I don't suspect anybody's going to jail, especially because Winchester resigned swiftly, and I don't. It would surprise me, I'll say, if somebody goes to jail for this money mismanagement.
So, I mean, is this going to be like? I mean, they effectively stole $12.5 million, but like nobody gets in trouble. You just have to like give it back.
Here's what my gut says. I think Bailey's right. I think Winchester's out. He ducked out. He's gone. I mean, he'll have to testify, but I think he took the hit he could take, and that was to lose his job. So far, the governor has been above the fray. Lieutenant governor has been above the fray. At this point, I think it's down to Gino DeMarco and Brent Swadley. I think Gino will lose his job, presumably, but who knows, right? He will try to shift the blame to Brent Swadley. And I think there will be this impetus of like, oh, well, he keeps donating to all of us. Maybe we just fine him and ask him to pay back a portion of it. And he may not, they'll probably like, some of this will go to subcontractors and it'll be up to him to recoup that money. But they will tell Swadley's he has to pay back, I don't know, $10 million. And then he will file for bankruptcy. It'll get tied up in the courts and the state will never see the money. That's my guess, but I don't know.
I think something like that would happen too. There are moments where there are folks who get killed in this country and don't receive justice, or like their murderers don't receive jail time. Like, yeah. You know what I mean?
Video. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I wish I had more faith that like things that, would happen the way that, would happen to other people, but I guess we'll see.
And I am certainly no fan of like, the criminal justice system as it currently like exists. And I'm certainly not a like prison is the answer to crimes necessarily. Like, I think you need to have a prison system or penal system, but ours is woefully inadequate in terms of, recidivism, in terms of rehabilitation, and in terms of all that. I think by really any measure, our penal system
and inequitable sentencing, right?
Yeah, right. All the things, but being that is the system that we have, it seems like someone should have to face some sort of consequences, as opposed to just like, oh, my bad, we were gonna do a fraud and you caught us, we won't do it again.
Well, I mean, because this wasn't an accident of, oops, we accidentally, misplaced a dot, or we typed in a wrong number or put in the wrong formula or whatever. Like, this was intentional, as Andy stated so well, a sweetheart deal, right? So yeah, what does accountability look like, especially because moments like this, like, taxpayers should be asking questions and have that healthy skepticism in moments of this. Is like, where do we go going forward to ensure these things aren't happening anymore? And I will also say, like, this is a reflection of when you have people who have never been in government before. Like, this government shouldn't run like a business. I mean, no business should run like this. But this is another example of how, like, governments are not businesses, right? And there has to be a level of accountability and protection of our taxpayer dollars. And that has not been happening. It's been a series of different things, right? Even beyond just the Swadley situation.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I say all of that, but it is important that while the House Investigative Committee doesn't have any criminal jurisdiction here, they're looking into it because they're supposed to look into it. But the state auditor is also investigating, and OSBI is investigating. And so there is the potential for criminal wrongdoing and charges to be filed.
Do you know? So at the federal level, right? So at the federal level, congressional committees like Congress, Congress can they can't charge people with crimes, but they can refer people, like they can refer cases to the DOJ, who can obviously charge people with crimes.
Right.
Can the state legislature, the state auditor and the USBI, as you said, are investigating. But if the special investigative committee, if they learn of new crimes, can they refer those to OSBI? Do they refer those can they refer things to the attorney general? I would assume
OSBI is watching the hearings the same way that we are, right? And that they are taking notes on the chance that a legislator asks a question they haven't asked, right? And you never know. And so I would suspect that there is some coordination there. And Bailey just wrote in our little chat here, yes, I think you're right. There is an investigation into the misspending of Federal CARES Act. And so even if there's not charges at the state level, there's a potential for some charges at the federal level here too, right? So anyway, this was just the first hearing of the House Investigative Committee. They have not set the date for the next hearing, but it will likely continue. And from what I hear, I mean, all the reporters are like, "Oh yeah, we've got more information. We just don't have a chance to write it all up yet." So it'll continue to trickle out for the next several months.
And the committees can keep meeting even after sine die, right? The committees can meet even when they're not in session.
Yeah, because this is not legislative business per se. So this is not like a formal committee meeting that would tie to legislative session. So
yep.
Interesting. Anybody know how many investigations are STIT and STIT appointees facing? It seems I'm kind of losing track. It seems like there's a lot.
There's a lot.
But also tag agents.
Yes.
There was some drama in the tag agency world this week.
Yeah, it was a good piece by NonDoc, right?
Yeah, speaking of indictments, the multi-county grand jury filed their report on Thursday, and in it were a number of findings, as well as a whole list of recommendations, and which is a little weird. We'll talk about that. But the report says, among other things, that Governor Stitt put improper political pressure on his appointees, namely those at the Pardon and Parole Board, and kind of recommended that he not do that. They also recommended that the District Attorney's Council have a greater role in some of this, which I think is interesting because the grand jury is convened by the DA, and the grand jury's authority really is just to decide if someone should be charged, right? They're trying to make up decide if there's enough evidence to indict somebody. and not to make like policy recommendations, but it was a long report, like 40 something pages. And a lot of it was just like, here's what we think they should do. And I was like, that's not what you're supposed to be doing, grand jury. But yes, there was also some of the recommendations and findings were related to the tag agency world and Representative O'Donnell and his wife. I mean, the grand jury recommended that legislators' spouses not be allowed to own tag agencies, which used to be the law, and then lawmakers changed it, and now they can. But I don't understand. And from the attorneys I've talked to, they all kind of also agree that the grand jury is being used as a political tool here, and not really what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Am I missing something? Are grand juries now some kind of legislative body that should be issuing policy recommendations?
No, and my understanding from I think there was an Oklahoma Watch piece about this as well. I think that might even be against the law. Like, there's a law that says grand juries are not supposed to like make allegations or accusations against federal or against state officials. Like, it seems very improper.
How did this begin? That's something I was missing of. Why were they able to even do this in the first place?
Well, you see, David Prater got them together in a room.
Right. I mean, this is the thing, right? Like, I'm trying to find this quote here.
Well, Scott, while you're looking for that, I will acknowledge that this is an issue that I even find myself agreeing with someone from OCPA with whom I generally disagree, right? Ryan Haney tweeted that for a report that makes so much hay out of transparency, the grand jury may be one of the most opaque institutions we have. For a state that rarely uses the grand jury for actual indictments, we're on a weird path of using them for political hit jobs. And I read that and was like, well, yeah, not wrong, Ryan.
Agreed. Especially, I mean, the pendulum always swings. So it doesn't matter whether it's, Governor Stitt today or somebody else tomorrow. Like, we got to have, I'm not even trying to say transparency, but like, we got to have equity in how people are treated. So it's not dependent upon if a certain DA has a qualm with
right.
a person or whatever. It could be agnostic to whoever is serving in a seat. I agree with that, Andy.
I mean, the grand jury only sees what the DA who convened them wants them to see. They're the ones that bring the testimony, the evidence, everything. They bring it in and say, here's all the stuff that I want to present to you. What do you think I should do about it? There's no evidentiary rules about it, no procedures to like allow them to see other evidence. Like if they wanted to say, well, what about the other side? Like that's not an option. And so they do nothing but, follow the instructions of the DA. And so that was the thing that like really shook me when I was like, are they recommending the DA's council take on some additional responsibility and like have more power? Like, of course they're recommending that. The DAs who convene them, it's such a
right
like, insular circle.
Yeah, this is as you mentioned, this is the rare instance where I actually agreed with the statement from OCPA that was retweeted by one of the governor's spokespeople. I was like, yeah, this seems like kind of bullshit, to be honest. Like that this it does seem like it's Prater kind of trying to exert some political pressure or political
especially
pressure
on his way out the door, right?
Like, now, like, I'm not opposed to convening a grand jury for the purpose of looking at evidence and potentially issuing indictments about it. Like there are I can see some merits to the grand jury process. There's an argument to be made there. I just don't think that this is playing out the way that most of us expected it to.
And a reminder, there will be an election coming up for Oklahoma County to have a new DA, and it'll be the first time in a really long time that Oklahoma County will have a different person serving as DA. And so I encourage our listeners to do your research on who's running. if there are candidate forums in your communities over the next few months related to that role, attend and ask them questions about things like this, because you need to know where they stand on grand juries doing things like this, right? And if they support that, is that somebody you need as a DA, right?
So I found it. This was a statement. This was a statement from Charlie Hanema, who's the governor's spokesperson. It says, "Quote: The grand jury process was a sham from the beginning and culminated with a report verifying this was little more than an outgoing prosecutor's latest abuse of the public's trust to target his opponents." That's all kind of just politics speak. But what I find interesting, it says Oklahoma law explicitly prohibits grand juries from making allegations that public officials have engaged in misconduct. So, I mean, surely that doesn't mean that grand juries can't indict public officials, but maybe they have to only, like, if you're not going to indict them,
don't make the recommendations. Yeah.
Right. Like if you're not going to, if they didn't do crimes, you can't just say that they were shitty.
Right. I mean, which kind of makes sense. Like, if it's not enough evidence to say you want to put them on trial, you shouldn't be like, well, it's not as much, but here's what you should do differently next time. Right. And it's like, that's not
your job.
Not your job. Well, we will certainly keep an eye on that as well. I expect that too will result in more information as we get closer to the elections this year. And then maybe as we begin to wind down here, we've got a few minutes left. Speaking of elections, there was an interesting story on NonDoc today, or no, this week, I guess it was on Wednesday, that I'd missed. And, a while back, you guys, we talked about when Department of Veterans Affairs Director Joel Kinsel got into the governor's race. There were accusations that he was making accusations that someone had been tampering with his department's computers. And I don't think he actually said it, but I think he hinted that he thought it might be someone from the governor's office or campaign. Once they heard that he might run for governor, that they were trying to sneak in on stuff. But apparently both Joel Kinsel and then Gina Nelson, who's the Democrat who's running for state superintendent, both of their campaign websites were blocked by the state's Wi-Fi network. And OMES was like, listen, it's because they were new websites and it's an automated thing. And this is, this happens. But given those two individuals, it doesn't say that there was any other candidates' websites blocked. It just seemed like a little suspicious to me. And I presumably to these candidates, right? That like they are both challenging, Governor Stitt and Secretary Walters, right? So two guys who are in statewide elected positions that we know are friends. Ryan Walters is a governor appointee. And
only one is in a statewide elected position.
That's true. I take that back. Both running for statewide elected positions, but those two guys are friends, and for their opponents' websites to be blocked, it seemed a little suspicious. Do we think this was actually malfeasance or just like a weird technical glitch?
It's hard to prove, right? So, I mean, considering other allegations before, it wouldn't be surprising. But also, if there's technical glitches in state government technology, that also isn't far-fetched, right?
Yeah. Well, because they can specify what websites are whitelisted or blacklisted. And the NonDoc article says all other statewide campaign websites in the gubernatorial and the state superintendent races were also accessible. So and Kinsel just said, well, that's convenient. So it's all been unblocked now. But I just also thought, like, what a silly, if true, what a silly petty thing. Like, you're going to block it from like a few hundred employees from getting to one person's website on their desktop computers. They could still do it from their phones. Like, it just seemed like a silly thing to do.
Well, and I could believe it more if other opponents of Ryan Walters and others were blocked, because his biggest hurdle right now is the Republican primary, right? So if he didn't block people or whitelist April Grace or someone, you know what I'm saying? Because if that would have happened, then that would have overtly shown that there was intentional trying to block folks. But Jenna Nelson isn't a person he's going to be running against until after August, maybe, right, depending on who ends that runoff. So that it wouldn't make sense to me of who would have been chosen to be listed.
Yeah.
But
interesting. Well, I just thought that was funny. There was also an interesting article. I don't think we have time to get into it, but it talked about it was back to the tag agency issue. It was about Greg Treat and Terry O'Donnell. The article, it was written by Trace Savage there at NonDoc, is called The Weird Political Misadventure of Two Tag Agent Bills. And it goes back to the year like 1978 or even before that. And talks about how Senator Treat grew up in Catoosa, which is also where Terry O'Donnell is from, and that when Senator Treat was 4 months old, two men robbed the Catoosa tag agency, tied up the employees with duct tape. One of those employees was named Georgia McAfee, who years later ends up that she is Terry O'Donnell's mother-in-law, right? So Georgia McAfee, her mom owned the tag agency, then she inherited it, and now her daughter, I don't know her name, but it's Representative O'Donnell's wife, is set to inherit it. And it was just this like, what a weird kind of hyper-local political story, right? That two men who didn't know each other before, families who were not related, now end up about this bill where Senator Treat had first declined to hear it or something on their side. And it was like such a weird intersection. Anyway, all that to say, you should read the article. I'll link to it in the show notes. And kudos to Trace Savage for doing a bit of Oklahoma history for us.
I mean, they always do a great job with everything they have over there. Every piece they do is well written and well researched. So many thanks to Trace, per usual.
Yeah. I will also a shout out to Mike Allen, who does their political cartoons over there.
Yes.
He does a great job. And there was an episode of the NonDoc podcast, which they don't do that regularly these days, but it was a few months ago, and they interviewed him about his process of doing the cartoons. And it was really interesting. This is not something I was very familiar with, but I appreciated him kind of giving an inside look. One thing that I stuck with me was that whenever he draws Governor Stitt, his eyebrows get a little bit bigger, like each time. Like it's like a running kind of gag. And I thought that's really interesting. So, all right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Bailey had to hop off just now so that she could drive back to Oklahoma City. So that just leaves me and Scott. So Scott, thanks for being here.
Hey man, appreciate it.
Listeners, thank you for being here as well. We hope that you find a few ways to take care of yourself. I know a lot of folks are feeling pretty burned out at the end of session, as is often the case. So take some time off this weekend to relax. If you're going to the Capitol for any of the marches or demonstrations this weekend in support of women's rights, maybe I'll see you out there. We'll be there on Saturday. And remember, decisions are made by those who show up. So whether it's at the Capitol for a protest, whether it's at the ballot box in June, you have a chance to be involved in the decisions that shape our state. Please, I beg you, ask your friends and neighbors if they're registered to vote. There's just a couple of weeks left to get registered, and make sure people know that there is an election in June. A primary election in Oklahoma is incredibly important. Thanks, and have a good week.